He saved 6 Apache girls, never knowing they would change his life forever. The rifle crack echoed across the canyon before Jack Miller even saw the smoke. He pulled his horse to a stop on the ridge, squinting through the desert heat at the scene below. 3 covered wagons burned in a tight circle while men on horseback circled like wolves. The screams reached him a second later, high and terrified, cutting through the afternoon air like broken glass. Jack counted 7 riders, maybe 8. His hand moved to the Winchester at his saddle, fingers wrapping around familiar wood. He was 1 man against nearly 10, but those screams meant someone was dying down there, and he had never been good at riding away from trouble. He kicked his horse forward, down the rocky slope at a pace that sent stones skittering. The animal protested but obeyed, hooves finding purchase on the treacherous path. As he got closer, Jack could see the raiders more clearly. Rough men, outlaws by the look of them, not soldiers or Apache. They wore dust-covered clothes and carried repeating rifles, expensive weapons for common thieves. One of the wagons collapsed inward as fire consumed its frame. A girl darted from behind it, maybe 12 years old, her dark hair flying behind her. An outlaw wheeled his horse toward her, laughing as she ran. Jack raised his rifle and fired in one smooth motion. The man tumbled backward off his saddle, and suddenly all eyes turned upward to the ridge. Jack fired again, levering another round as fast as his hands could move. A second raider grabbed his shoulder and fell. The others scattered, shouting in confusion, trying to locate the shooter while controlling their spooked horses. Jack used their chaos, putting 3 more rounds into the group before his rifle clicked empty. He dropped the Winchester into its scabbard and drew his revolver, urging his horse down the final slope at a full gallop. Bullets whined past his head, but he kept low, firing as he rode. 2 raiders broke and ran, disappearing into the rocks to the east. The remaining 3 tried to regroup, but Jack was among them now, his horse crashing into theirs. He shot 1 man at point-blank range, the revolver's report deafening. Another swung a rifle like a club, and Jack ducked, feeling the weapon pass inches from his skull. He twisted in the saddle and fired again, the bullet taking the man in the chest. The last raider turned his horse and fled, whipping the animal mercilessly as he raced away into the desert. Jack let him go, his heart hammering as he wheeled his horse around, searching for more threats. The burning wagons crackled and popped, sending embers into the sky. Bodies lay scattered in the dirt, men in rough clothes who would never rob again. But where were the people from the wagons? Movement caught his eye near the smallest wagon, the one that had not caught fire yet. 6 girls emerged slowly from underneath it, crawling out from where they had hidden in the narrow space beneath. They were Apache, ranging in age from maybe 8 to 15, all of them covered in dust and terror. Their eyes were wide, watching him with the wariness of wild animals. Jack holstered his revolver slowly, keeping his hands visible. The oldest girl stepped forward, placing herself between him and the younger ones. She spoke in Apache, words he did not understand, but her tone was clear enough. She was asking who he was, what he wanted. He dismounted carefully, leaving his weapons where they were. The smart thing would be to ride away, let them find their own people. But the desert stretched for miles in every direction, and these girls had no horses, no water that he could see. The raiders had taken everything. Jack pointed to himself and said his name slowly, then he pointed to his horse, to the water bags hanging from the saddle. The oldest girl watched him for a long moment, then spoke to the others in rapid Apache. They huddled together, clearly afraid but also clearly desperate. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and Jack knew they had maybe an hour of good light left. Whatever decision was made needed to happen now. He took a water bag from his saddle and held it out, arm extended, waiting. The oldest girl took 3 steps forward and snatched the water bag, retreating quickly. She opened it, sniffed it cautiously, then took a small sip. After a moment, she nodded and passed it to the others. They drank in turns, trying not to gulp despite their obvious thirst. Jack looked at the burning wagons and the dead men scattered around them. This had been a slave raid, he realized. The outlaws had been taking these girls somewhere, probably to sell them across the border. His stomach turned at the thought. He needed to get them somewhere safe, but where? The nearest town was 30 miles south, and he had no idea if these girls had a camp or family nearby. He pointed in different directions, trying to ask if they had people, a home. The oldest girl shook her head at each direction, then pointed north and west, her hand making a sweeping gesture that seemed to mean far away. The sun touched the horizon, painting the desert orange and red. Jack made a decision. He would take them north, toward the mountains, where he knew Apache bands sometimes camped. It was risky, but leaving them here was certain death. He gestured for them to follow and started walking his horse, leading it by the reins. After a moment's hesitation, the girls followed, keeping their distance but staying close enough to not lose sight of him in the gathering darkness. Jack walked through the night, leading his horse with 6 silent shadows trailing behind him. The oldest girl stayed closest, never more than 10 feet back, while the younger ones clustered together like a small herd. He stopped twice to let them rest and share more water, rationing it carefully. His own throat felt like sandpaper, but the girls needed it more. By dawn, they reached a rocky outcrop that offered shade and cover. Jack's legs ached from walking, but he did not let it show. The girls collapsed in the shade immediately, exhausted. The youngest one, who could not have been more than etched, was crying quietly, tears making tracks through the dust on her face. The oldest girl sat beside her, speaking softly in Apache, stroking her hair. Jack watched them and felt something twist in his chest. He had no children of his own, had never stayed in one place long enough for that kind of life, but seeing these girls, lost and afraid, made him remember why he had never been able to just ride past trouble. He unsaddled his horse and checked the animal for injuries. Finding none, he hobbled it where it could reach some scrub grass. Then he pulled out his remaining supplies, hard biscuits and jerky, not much for 7 people. He divided it as fairly as he could and offered portions to each girl. They ate slowly, making the small meal last. Jack noticed the oldest girl gave half of hers to the youngest, and he pretended not to see. When they finished, he tried again to communicate, drawing in the dirt with a stick. He drew mountains, trying to ask if that was where their people were. The oldest girl studied his drawing, then took the stick. She added to it, sketching what looked like a valley between peaks, then drawing small circles that might have been homes or camps. She pointed north and west again, then held up fingers. 10, then 10 more, then 10 again. 30 of something. Days, maybe, or miles. 30 days was impossible. 30 miles they could manage, but it would take time and a lot of luck. Jack nodded and drew a path from where they were to the mountains. The girl watched, then nodded slowly. She seemed to understand he was offering to help. One of the middle girls spoke up then, pointing at Jack and saying something that sounded like a question. The oldest girl answered, and several of them looked at him differently, less afraid. He wondered what had been said but had no way to ask. They rested through the heat of the day, taking turns sleeping while others kept watch. Jack noticed the girls had their own system, their own way of organizing themselves. The oldest gave quiet instructions, and the others obeyed without question. They had survived something terrible, and they were still surviving, still taking care of each other. As the sun started its descent, they prepared to move again. Jack had been thinking about their situation all day, turning the problem over in his mind. They needed food, more water, and eventually horses. The nearest settlement where he could get those things was Broken Creek, a small town about 15 miles east. But bringing Apache girls into a frontier town was asking for trouble of a different kind. He decided to risk it anyway. They would die out here without supplies, and he was not going to let that happen. He gestured for the girls to follow and started walking east instead of north. The oldest girl's eyes narrowed, and she spoke sharply in Apache, clearly questioning the change in direction. Jack stopped and drew in the dirt again, sketching buildings to represent a town, then drawing supplies, food, water. The girl stared at the drawing, then at him, clearly uncertain. She spoke to the others, and they had a quick, heated discussion in their own language. Finally, she nodded, but her expression was wary. They walked through another night, moving faster now that they had rested. Jack kept them to rocky ground where their tracks would not show clearly. He did not know if the outlaws who had escaped would come back with reinforcements, but he was not taking chances. By morning, they could see Broken Creek in the distance, a collection of weathered buildings squatting beside a nearly dry stream bed. Jack had them wait in a stand of cottonwoods while he scouted ahead. The town looked quiet, just a few people moving between buildings in the early light. He returned to the girls and tried to explain that they needed to stay hidden. The oldest girl understood immediately, gathering the others deeper into the trees. Jack walked into town alone, his horse's hooves raising small clouds of dust on the main street. The general store was just opening when he arrived. The owner, a thin man named Pete Carson, looked up from sweeping his porch and nodded. Jack had been through Broken Creek a few times before, enough to be recognized if not exactly welcomed. He bought supplies quickly and paid in silver coins without haggling. Beans, dried meat, corn flour, coffee, and most importantly, 4 full water skins. Pete watched the pile grow with obvious curiosity, but had the sense not to ask questions. Frontier towns survived by minding their own business. Jack was loading the supplies onto his horse when he heard boots on the boardwalk behind him. He turned slowly and found himself facing Sheriff Dan Cooper, a stocky man with a gray beard and suspicious eyes. Cooper had his thumbs hooked in his belt, not threatening, but not friendly either. The sheriff looked at the supplies, then at Jack. They had met once before, a brief and not particularly pleasant encounter. Cooper was the kind of lawman who kept the peace by being harder than anyone else in town, and he did not much care for drifters. Jack nodded a greeting and continued loading his horse. Cooper stepped closer, eyes scanning the supplies again. Too much food for one man, and everyone in town would notice that. Jack cursed himself for not being more careful, but it was too late now. Cooper asked where Jack was headed, and Jack said north, keeping his answer vague. The sheriff grunted, clearly not satisfied. He mentioned there had been reports of trouble to the west, burned wagons, and dead men. Some folks thought it might have been Apache raiders. His eyes were hard when he said it, watching for Jack's reaction. Jack kept his face neutral and said he had heard nothing about it. Cooper studied him for a long moment, then warned him to be careful out there, the kind of warning that was really a threat. Jack thanked him and swung into his saddle, eager to be gone. He rode out of town at an easy pace, forcing himself not to look back. Once he was out of sight, he circled around through the brush, approaching the cottonwood stand from a different direction. The girls were where he had left them, watching him emerge from the trees with visible relief. Jack distributed the supplies, and they ate a quick meal, the first real food they had eaten in days. He watched their faces as they ate, seeing some of the tension leave their shoulders. The youngest girl actually smiled, just for a moment, before remembering to be afraid again. They moved north after that, putting distance between themselves and Broken Creek. Jack kept them off the main trails, following game paths and dry washes. It was slower going, but safer. He had a feeling Cooper would be asking questions about him, and the last thing they needed was a posse. On the third day after leaving town, they found water, a spring bubbling up from rocks in a small canyon. The girls drank deeply, and for the first time since he had found them, they seemed to relax. They washed their faces and hands, cleaning away days of dust and blood. The oldest girl approached Jack while the others played in the shallow water, the first moment of joy he had seen for many of them. She spoke in Apache, and though he could not understand the words, he heard the tone. She was thanking him. He nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude, and turned to check the horses. That night they made a small fire, hidden in the canyon where the light would not show. Jack taught the oldest girl how to make coffee, and she taught him an Apache word for water. It was a small thing, this exchange, but it felt important somehow. As he sat watch later, listening to the girls sleep, Jack wondered what he had gotten himself into. He had thought to save them and send them home, a simple act of decency. But nothing about this was simple. These girls were depending on him now, and he had no idea if he could get them safely to their people. In the darkness, something howled. Coyotes or maybe wolves. His horse shifted nervously, and Jack checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready. The desert was full of dangers, and they had a long way to go yet. They traveled north for 6 more days, following the mountain line as it rose from the desert floor. Jack learned the girls' names through gestures and repetition. The oldest was Nina, and she had taken on the role of mother to the others with a fierceness that impressed him. The youngest was Kaya, who had stopped crying but still watched the world with frightened eyes. The others were Mala, Tala, Yana, and Sena, each with their own personality emerging as they grew more comfortable. Mala had a quick smile despite everything. Tala was quiet but observant, always the first to spot danger. Yana and Sena were close in age and inseparable, whispering to each other in Apache whenever they stopped to rest. Jack found himself learning their language bit by bit, picking up words for basic things. Water, food, danger, rest. The girls seemed amused by his clumsy pronunciation, and sometimes they would giggle when he got something particularly wrong. It was good to hear them laugh, even at his expense. On the 7th day, they saw riders in the distance, 3 men heading south along the base of the mountains. Jack got the girls hidden in rocks and watched through his spyglass. The men were not outlaws, at least not obviously so, but they were heavily armed and looking for something. After 20 minutes, they rode on, and Jack allowed himself to breathe again. Nina came to stand beside him as he watched the riders disappear. She pointed at them, then at herself and the other girls, making a questioning gesture. Jack understood. She was asking if those men were looking for them. He shrugged, honest in his uncertainty. Maybe the outlaws had put out word about missing merchandise. Maybe someone else was searching. Either way, it meant they needed to be more careful. They climbed higher into the mountains, where the air grew cooler and pine trees replaced desert scrub. Jack's horse struggled with the altitude, and they had to stop more frequently. The girls seemed energized by the change in landscape, pointing at things and talking among themselves with growing excitement. On the 10th day, they found sign of other Apache. Old campfires, carefully arranged stones, marks on trees that meant something to those who knew how to read them. Nina studied these signs with intense focus, sometimes touching them reverently. Jack stayed back, letting her work through whatever she was seeing. That night, Nina drew in the dirt, showing Jack what she had found. Her people had been here, perhaps a month ago, moving north ahead of the summer heat. She drew more mountains, bigger than the ones they were in now, and pointed north. 2 days, maybe 3, she seemed to indicate. Jack felt relief wash through him. They were close. Soon he could leave the girls with their people and go back to his own wandering life. The thought should have brought comfort, but instead it felt hollow, like losing something he had not realized he valued. The next morning, they woke to find fresh tracks around their camp. Unshod horses, several of them, had circled their position during the night. Jack's hand went to his rifle, but Nina stopped him, shaking her head. She pointed at the tracks and spoke rapidly in Apache, her tone excited rather than afraid. She led him away from camp, following the tracks to where they led up a rocky slope. At the top of the rise, Jack saw them, 6 Apache warriors on horseback, watching from a distance. They made no move to approach, simply sat their horses and observed. Nina called out in Apache, and one of the warriors responded. A conversation followed, questions and answers flowing in a language Jack could not follow. Finally, Nina turned to him, and her expression was complicated, grateful, and sad at the same time. She spoke slowly, using the few English words she had picked up in gestures to fill in the gaps. These warriors were from her band. They had been searching for the girls since they were taken. News of the raid had reached them weeks ago, but the trail had gone cold until now. Jack nodded, understanding. This was the end of his journey with them. He should feel relieved, successful, but instead he felt an unexpected ache. The girls had become part of his days, their presence filling a loneliness he had not acknowledged. The warriors came down from the ridge slowly, their eyes never leaving Jack. They were young men, probably in their 20s, lean and hard from life in the mountains. They looked at Jack with open curiosity and some suspicion, clearly trying to understand why a white man would be traveling with 6 Apache girls. Nina spoke to them at length, gesturing at Jack, at the girls, telling the story of their rescue. The warriors' expressions changed as she talked, suspicion giving way to something else. One of them, who seemed to be the leader, rode forward and addressed Jack directly in broken English. He said his name was Nako, and he thanked Jack for protecting the girls. The simple words carried weight, and Jack recognized honor when he heard it. He replied that anyone would have done the same, though they both knew that was not true. Most men would have ridden past, not wanting the trouble. Nako asked Jack to come to their camp, to meet their elders and accept proper thanks. Jack hesitated. Going deeper into Apache territory was not wise for a white man, even one who had helped them. But refusing felt wrong after everything they had been through together. The girls were already gathering their few belongings, chattering excitedly with the warriors. Kaya ran to Jack and grabbed his hand, tugging him toward the horses. She spoke in Apache, words tumbling over each other. Nina translated, a smile on her face. Kaya wanted him to come, wanted him to meet her mother. Jack found himself agreeing before he fully realized it. Nako nodded and gestured for him to follow. They rode north together, the warriors forming a loose escort around Jack and the girls. It should have felt like being a prisoner, but it did not. They treated him with respect, these young warriors, keeping their rifles across their saddles but not pointed in his direction. The Apache camp was hidden in a valley between 2 peaks, a place where grass grew thick and a stream ran year-round. Wickiups dotted the valley floor, traditional dome-shaped structures covered in brush and hides. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and people stopped their work to watch as the group rode in. The girls jumped from the horses before they fully stopped, running toward Wickiups while calling out. Women emerged, crying and laughing at the same time, gathering the girls into fierce embraces. Jack watched reunions happen all around him, mothers finding daughters, families made whole again. An older man approached, his hair shot through with gray, his face lined with years of sun and wisdom. He wore a simple buckskin shirt and carried himself with quiet authority. This was clearly someone important, a chief or elder. Nako spoke to him in Apache, pointing at Jack, explaining. The old man studied Jack with eyes that seemed to see everything. Then he spoke in surprisingly good English, introducing himself as Chief Delgado. He said Jack had done his people a great service, one that would not be forgotten. The formal words carried genuine warmth, and Jack found himself relaxing slightly. Delgado invited Jack to stay the night to eat with them and rest. It would have been rude to refuse, and truthfully Jack was exhausted from days of constant travel and worry. He agreed, and Delgado assigned a young boy to tend his horse. That evening they gathered around a large fire. The entire band seemed to be there, maybe 50 people in total. They roasted meat and shared food, and Delgado asked Jack to tell the story of the rescue. Jack did his best, keeping it simple, leaving out the parts where he had been scared or uncertain. When he finished, Nina stood and spoke. She told a different version, one where Jack had ridden down the mountain like thunder, where his shots had been impossibly accurate, where he had walked through bullets to reach them. The girls added details, building him into something he was not, a hero from a story. Jack felt his face grow hot with embarrassment, but the Apache listened with serious faces. When Nina finished, Delgado nodded slowly. He said the girls spoke truth as they saw it, and who was Jack to argue with their sight? The old man's eyes twinkled with humor, and Jack realized he was being teased gently. The night wore on, and people drifted away to their wiki-ups. Jack was given a place by the fire, blankets, and a spot sheltered from the wind. He lay down, expecting to fall asleep immediately, but his mind was too full. Nina approached while he was still awake, sitting beside him at a respectful distance. She spoke in Apache, then tried English, struggling with the words. Finally, she gave up and simply took his hand, squeezing it once. Then she went to her mother's wiki-up, leaving Jack alone with the dying fire. He understood what she had been trying to say. Thank you felt too small for what had passed between them, for the journey they had shared. Some things did not need words, and this was one of them. Jack slept deeply that night, more peacefully than he had in years. When he woke, the sun was already high and he could smell food cooking. He sat up, disoriented for a moment, then remembered where he was. Chief Delgado found him after breakfast, sitting with him in the shade of a large pine. The old man spoke about his band, about the difficulties of their life, constantly moving to stay ahead of soldiers and settlers. He spoke about the girls, how their capture had devastated the community. Then he grew quiet, looking at Jack with those penetrating eyes. He said Jack had a choice to make. He could leave today, go back to his wandering life, and they would part as friends. Or he could stay, for a time at least, and learn their ways. The band could use a man who shot as well as Jack did, who had shown he could be trusted. Jack was surprised by the offer. White men did not typically live among the Apache by choice. It was a dangerous life, hunted by the army and hated by settlers. But it was also a life with purpose, with community, something Jack had been missing without realizing it. He thought about the trail he had been riding before finding the girls, going from town to town with no real destination. He thought about the loneliness of his campfires, the emptiness of his days. Then he thought about the girls' laughter, the way Kaya had grabbed his hand, the trust in Nina's eyes. Jack heard himself say he would stay, at least for a while. Delgado nodded as if he had expected this answer. The old man stood and placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, a gesture of welcome that felt like a vow. Jack woke to the sound of the camp stirring, people moving between wiki-ups as dawn painted the valley in shades of gold and pink. He had been with the Apache for 3 weeks now, and the rhythms of their life were becoming familiar. Women ground corn and tended fires while children chased each other through the grass, their laughter carrying on the morning air. Nina found him outside the wiki-up Delgado had given him. She carried 2 bowls of something that smelled like cornmeal and meat, breakfast that she had made herself. Her English had improved remarkably in the weeks since their reunion, and Jack's Apache was getting better too, though he still stumbled over the more complex phrases. She sat beside him, and they ate in comfortable silence. Then she told him her mother wanted to speak with him. Jack felt a flutter of nervousness. Nina's mother, a woman named Ayana, had been polite but distant since his arrival. She had thanked him formally for saving her daughter, but had kept her true feelings carefully hidden. He followed Nina to a wiki-up at the edge of the camp. Ayana sat outside, working on a buckskin shirt with careful stitches. She was younger than Jack had first thought, probably in her early 30s, with Nina's same dark eyes and strong features. When she saw them approach, she set her work aside and gestured for Jack to sit. Nina started to stay, but her mother spoke sharply in Apache, and the girl reluctantly left them alone. Jack sat, trying not to show his discomfort. Ayana studied him for a long moment, and Jack had the uncomfortable feeling of being measured and found uncertain. Finally, she spoke in halting English. She said she had watched him these past weeks, seen how the children followed him, how he helped without being asked, how he learned their ways with respect rather than judgment. She had been afraid at first, afraid to trust a white man with her daughter's safety. But Nina trusted him completely, and that meant something. Then Ayana's expression softened and she told him about Nina's father. He had been a warrior killed 3 years ago in a fight with Mexican soldiers. Nina had been 12 then, forced to grow up too fast, to become strong for the younger children. The kidnapping had nearly broken something in her, but Jack's rescue had given her back her strength. Ayana reached out and took Jack's hand, a gesture that startled him. She said he had given her back her daughter twice, once from the slavers and once from the darkness that had been consuming Nina's spirit. For that, Ayanna would be forever in his debt. The words were formal, but her eyes were wet with tears she would not let fall. Jack did not know what to say. He told her he had only done what anyone should do, but she shook her head firmly. Most men would have done nothing, she said. Most men would have ridden past. But he had not, and that made all the difference. She released his hand and picked up the buckskin shirt she had been working on. She held it out to him, and Jack saw it was sized for him, carefully crafted with intricate beadwork along the shoulders. Ayanna said it was a gift, made with gratitude and respect. Jack took it carefully, running his fingers over the detailed work. It must have taken her days to make. He thanked her, his voice rough with emotion he had not expected. Ayanna smiled then, the first real smile she had given him, and patted his arm before returning to her work. Jack understood he had been dismissed, but in the kindest way possible. He had been accepted. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Mornings were spent hunting with the men, learning to move through the forest in silence, to read tracks and sign. Jack was a decent hunter already, but the Apache knew things he had never imagined, reading stories in broken twigs and disturbed earth. Nako became something like a friend, teaching Jack about the land and its secrets. The young warrior had a dry sense of humor and enjoyed testing Jack's developing language skills by speaking faster and faster until Jack had to admit defeat. But he was also fiercely protective of his people, and Jack respected that dedication. Afternoons were often spent with the children. Kaya had attached herself to Jack like a shadow, following him everywhere, chattering in Apache that he understood about half of. He taught her simple English words, and she taught him Apache phrases, many of which he suspected were not entirely proper from the way the other children giggled. The girls he had saved had scattered back to their families, but they sought him out often. Mala brought him food she had helped cook. Tala showed him plants that were safe to eat. Yana and Sena included him in their games, making him play roles in elaborate scenarios he barely understood. Nina visited every evening, bringing her mother's cooking and staying to talk about everything and nothing. Jack found himself changing in ways he had not anticipated. The constant vigilance of his old life was easing. He slept better, laughed more often, felt the tightness in his chest loosening. This band had accepted him not for what he could do for them, but for what he had already done. It was a strange and wonderful feeling. But the outside world would not leave them alone forever. On the 27th day of Jack's stay, scouts came racing into camp with urgent news. A cavalry patrol had been spotted 20 miles south, 30 soldiers led by a lieutenant who had a reputation for ruthlessness with Apache bands. The camp erupted into controlled chaos. Women began packing essential items, taking down wiki-ups that could be moved quickly. Warriors gathered weapons and checked ammunition. Children were rounded up and given quiet, firm instructions. This was clearly a drill they had practiced many times before. Delgado called a council of the warriors, and Jack was surprised to be included. The old chief laid out their options in his calm, measured way. They could run deeper into the mountains, but the soldiers might follow. They could try to negotiate, but this particular officer did not negotiate in good faith. Or they could prepare to fight if the soldiers found them. The warriors debated in rapid Apache, voices rising with passion. Jack understood enough to follow the main arguments. Some wanted to run immediately to preserve the lives of the children and elders. Others argued that running without knowing the soldiers' intentions was premature. A few young men wanted to ride out and attack the patrol before it could reach the camp. Nako turned to Jack and asked his opinion in English, making sure he understood the question. The other warriors watched him, waiting. Jack felt the weight of their attention and chose his words carefully. He said in his broken Apache that wisdom was often found in patience. They should send scouts to watch the soldiers and learn their path. If the patrol was just passing through, they could avoid a fight. If the soldiers were hunting them specifically, they would have time to prepare. Delgado nodded slowly, and several of the older warriors murmured agreement. The decision was made to send out scouts, while the camp prepared to move if necessary. Nako would lead the scouting party, and to Jack's surprise, he asked Jack to come along. They left within the hour, 4 warriors and Jack, riding hard to reach a position where they could observe the soldiers undetected. It took them most of the afternoon, but they found a ridge overlooking the route the patrol would likely take. They settled in to wait, taking turns watching through Jack's spyglass. The soldiers appeared near sunset, riding in a loose column with scouts ranging ahead. Jack counted 30 men, well-armed and well-mounted. They were not the typical frontier cavalry, poorly trained and poorly equipped. These were veteran soldiers who knew their business. Through the spyglass, Jack studied the officer leading them. Lieutenant Craig Dawson, from what Jack could see of the insignia on his uniform. He was young, maybe 30, with the kind of face that looked like he'd never smiled. He sat his horse with rigid military bearing and carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had never lost a fight. Nako and the other warriors conferred in whispers, trying to determine the patrol's destination. The soldiers were heading northwest, which could mean they were passing through, or it could mean they were heading toward the valley where the Apache camp was hidden. There was no way to tell for certain without following them. They shadowed the patrol through the night, staying well back and moving carefully. Jack was impressed by how quietly the Apache could move their horses, skills learned through generations of necessity. Enzo horse made more noise than all 4 of theirs combined, and he felt clumsy by comparison. By dawn, the patrol had changed direction, swinging more directly north toward the valley. Nako's expression grew grim, and he sent 1 warrior racing back to warn the camp. The remaining 3 continued to follow, needing to know for certain. At mid-morning, the patrol stopped at a water hole. The soldiers dismounted to rest their horses and refill canteens. Jack and the Apache watched from cover half a mile away. Then they saw something that made Jack's blood run cold. 2 men rode into the patrol's camp from the south, and even at this distance, Jack recognized the style of their clothes. These were not soldiers. They were frontiersmen, the kind who hired out as scouts or guides. One of them was talking to Lieutenant Dawson, gesturing north with clear purpose. Nako's hand clenched on his rifle. He spoke in Apache, his voice tight with anger, and one of the other warriors translated for Jack. Those scouts were known to their people, men who sold information about Apache camps to the army for gold. They must have spotted sign of the band and brought Dawson to collect his prize. The patrol mounted up after 30 minutes and continued north with renewed purpose. The scouts rode ahead, reading the ground, following a trail that Jack could not see, but that clearly existed. They were being hunted, and their hunters were skilled. The 3 Apache and Jack raced back to the valley, pushing their horses hard. They had maybe 4 hours head start, possibly less if the scouts were as good as Nako feared. When they reached the camp, they found it already half dismantled, the people working with urgent efficiency. Delgado listened to Nako's report with a face like stone. Then he made his decision. The elders, the women, and the children would move immediately, heading deeper into the mountains where the terrain was too rough for cavalry. The warriors would stay behind, not to fight but to slow the soldiers down, to buy time for the vulnerable to escape. It was a good plan, Jack thought. Probably their only plan. But it meant splitting up the band, and it meant the warriors would be badly outnumbered if things went wrong. Delgado looked at Jack and gave him a choice. He could go with the women and children to safety, or he could stay with the warriors. No one would think less of him for choosing safety. Jack thought about Nina, about Kaya, about Ayana, and all the others. He thought about the girls playing in the grass, the old women singing as they worked, the babies sleeping in cradle boards. Then he checked his rifle and told Delgado he would stay. The old chief gripped his shoulder, and Jack saw approval in those ancient eyes. Then Delgado went to oversee the evacuation, his voice calm and steady even as his people prepared to flee their home once again. Within 2 hours, the valley was empty except for the warriors. 15 men against 30 soldiers, fighting on ground they knew but outnumbered 2-1. They'd positioned themselves in the rocks above the valley, creating a natural bottleneck where the soldiers would have to ride through. Jack took a position beside Nako, his rifle loaded and ready. The young warrior looked at him and spoke in English. He said if this went badly, if they did not survive, Jack should know that his people were grateful. Jack replied that he would make sure it did not go badly, trying to sound more confident than he felt. They waited as the sun climbed toward noon. 15 men with rifles pointed at an empty valley, ready to defend people who had already left, buying time with their lives if necessary. The cavalry patrol entered the valley cautiously, scouts riding ahead with rifles ready. Lieutenant Dawson followed with his main force spread out in a skirmish line, professional and wary. Jack watched through his rifle sights, finger resting beside the trigger, waiting for Delgado's signal. The soldiers saw the abandoned camp and stopped. Dawson raised his hand, halting the column, and sent men forward to investigate the wiki-ups. They found the fires still warm, belongings scattered in haste, clear signs of recent occupation. One of the civilian scouts dismounted and studied the ground, then pointed northeast, reading the trail the Apache had left. Delgado remained perfectly still, watching the soldiers sort themselves out. The warriors were spread among the rocks, invisible from below. The plan was simple. If the soldiers tried to follow the fleeing band, the warriors would fire a few shots to turn them back, make them think twice about pursuit. If the soldiers retreated, they would let them go. No one wanted to fight, just enough harassment to protect their people. But Dawson was not retreating. He sent 10 men ahead to follow the trail while keeping the rest in the valley. Then he ordered his men to burn the remaining wiki-ups, to destroy everything the Apache had left behind. Jack felt Nako tense beside him, saw fury flash across the young warrior's face. The soldiers piled brush and belongings together and set them ablaze. Smoke rose into the clear mountain air as a lifetime of accumulated possessions went up in flames. Blankets, baskets, tools, clothing, all the small things that made a camp into a home, destroyed out of casual cruelty. One soldier found a cradleboard, intricately decorated with beadwork and generations old. He laughed and tossed it into the fire. That was when Nako fired. The shot cracked across the valley, and the soldier dropped his torch, grabbing his arm where the bullet had grazed him. The valley erupted in chaos. Soldiers dove for cover, shouting and pointing at the rocks where smoke from Nako's rifle had betrayed his position. Dawson was screaming orders, organizing his men with impressive speed. More rifles opened up from the rocks, the Apache firing carefully, making each shot count. Jack fired twice, aiming high, trying to pin the soldiers down without killing anyone. This was supposed to be a deterrent, not a massacre. But the soldiers were returning fire now, bullets whining off rocks and kicking up dirt. One struck close enough to Jack that he felt stone chips sting his face. Delgado shouted in Apache, ordering a retreat to secondary positions deeper in the rocks. The warriors moved in pairs, covering each other as they pulled back. Jack went with Nako, scrambling up a steep slope while bullets pursued them. They reached a new position behind a boulder and caught their breath. Below, Dawson had regrouped his men and was organizing an assault on the rocks. He had divided his force, sending some up both sides of the valley to flank the Apache positions. The civilian scouts were directing them, pointing out paths and approaches. The soldiers moved well, using cover, advancing in short rushes. Nako spoke urgently in Apache, and Jack understood enough. They were in trouble. The original plan had assumed the soldiers would back off after a few shots. Instead, Dawson was pressing the attack, and his flanking maneuver would soon put soldiers above the Apache positions. They needed to retreat further, but that meant giving up ground and allowing the soldiers to pursue the fleeing families. Jack thought fast. The soldiers were focused on the rocks, on the warriors they knew were there. They were not watching the valley floor anymore. He had an idea, risky but possibly their only option. He grabbed Nako's arm and explained in broken Apache mixed with gestures. Nako's eyes widened. Then he grinned fiercely. He called to the nearest warriors, explaining Jack's plan. Some looked skeptical, but Delgado overheard and gave a sharp nod. It was worth trying. Jack and 3 warriors slipped down the backside of their position, moving fast through a ravine that led back to the valley floor. They reached the horses the Apache had hidden in a side canyon, mounted quickly and rode hard toward the valley entrance. They burst into view with rifles firing, not at soldiers but into the air, whooping and shouting like they were attacking. The effect was immediate. The soldiers on the flanking maneuvers turned back, thinking they were being overrun from behind. Dawson pulled his men together, forming a defensive perimeter. Jack and the warriors raced across the valley floor, drawing fire but moving too fast for accurate shooting. They reached the far side and disappeared into the rocks, leaving the soldiers confused and disorganized. The maneuver had bought them minutes, maybe more. Delgado used those minutes well. He pulled all the warriors back to a position where they could not be flanked, a narrow defile with steep walls on both sides. The soldiers would have to come at them head-on if they wanted to continue the fight. It was defensible, but also a potential trap, if the soldiers had the patience to wait them out. Dawson proved to have that patience. After his men took several casualties trying to assault the defile, he pulled back and established a siege position. He sent riders to fetch the 10 men who had been pursuing the families, bringing his full force together. Then he settled in to wait, clearly planning to starve the Apache out. Night fell, and the situation remained unchanged. The warriors had water from a spring in the rocks, but no food. The soldiers had both, and they also had time. Eventually, the warriors would have to either surrender or try to break out, and both options would cost lives. Jack sat with his back against cold stone, listening to the soldiers below making camp. Fires bloomed in the darkness, and he could hear them talking and laughing, confident in their superior position. Beside him, Nako was quiet, thinking. Around midnight, Delgado gathered the warriors for a council. He laid out the reality in blunt terms. They could not stay here forever, and they could not fight their way through 30 soldiers. But if they surrendered, they would be taken to a reservation, or possibly hanged. The lieutenant had a reputation for harsh treatment of prisoners. One of the older warriors suggested they try to slip away in the darkness, but the civilian scouts would spot their tracks at dawn. Another proposed a fighting withdrawal, but that would likely mean casualties they could not afford. The discussion went in circles, 15 men trying to find a solution to an impossible problem. Then Nako spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the darkness. He said Jack should go. Jack was not Apache, was not wanted by the army. He could slip out, make his way past the soldiers, and continue on. The warriors would buy him time to escape, and at least one of them would survive. Jack started to protest, but Delgado raised his hand, silencing him. The old chief studied Jack's face in the starlight, and Jack saw the pain in those eyes. Delgado said Nako was right. Jack had risked enough for them already. It was time for him to save himself. But Jack shook his head. He had made a choice weeks ago when he decided to stay with the band. These men were not just allies or friends, they were family now, in all the ways that mattered. He was not leaving them to die while he rode away to safety. His words, spoken in careful Apache, brought silence to the group. Then one of the warriors reached out and gripped Jack's shoulder, a gesture of brotherhood. Others followed, and Jack felt the weight of their acceptance, their trust. Delgado spoke then, his voice thick with emotion. He said Jack honored them with his loyalty, but loyalty worked both ways. He would not allow Jack to die here when there was a chance to live. That was his decision as chief, and it was final. Jack wanted to argue, but he saw the resolve in Delgado's face. This was not about Jack's choice anymore. It was about the chief protecting someone he considered under his care. Jack had to respect that, even though it tore at him to leave. They prepared him for departure, giving him the fastest horse, enough food and water for several days, and directions to a settlement where he could find safety. Nako drew a map in the dirt by firelight, showing Jack the route that would keep him clear of the soldiers below. Nina appeared out of the darkness, and Jack realized someone must have sent for her. She should have been miles away with the evacuees, but she had stayed, hiding nearby. Her face was streaked with tears, but her voice was steady when she spoke. She told Jack in English that he had taught her something important. He had shown her that courage was not about being unafraid. It was about choosing to do the right thing even when fear tried to stop you. She would remember that for the rest of her life. Jack pulled her into a hug, something he had never done before, propriety be damned. She clung to him for a moment, then stepped back and wiped her eyes. She reached into a pouch at her belt and pulled out something small, pressing it into his hand. A carved stone horse, barely bigger than his thumb, worn smooth by handling. Nina said her father had made it for her when she was small. It had protected her through hard times, and now she wanted Jack to have it. He started to refuse, but she closed his fingers around it firmly. Some gifts could not be refused. Ayana stepped forward then, and Jack saw that several of the women had come as well, saying goodbye to their warriors, their men. She embraced Jack quickly, whispering words in Apache he did not quite catch, then pressed something into his other hand, the beaded pouch she always wore containing herbs and sacred items. Protection for the journey ahead. The other girls found him too. Kaya wrapped her arms around his waist and would not let go until her mother gently pried her loose. Mala gave him a brave smile through her tears. Tala touched his hand once, her eyes saying what words could not. Yana and Sena stood together, holding hands, watching him with solemn faces. Jack felt his throat close up, emotions threatening to overwhelm him. These people had become more precious to him than he had realized. The thought of leaving them, of riding away while they faced uncertain fate, was almost unbearable. But Delgado was firm. As the moon reached its peak, Jack mounted his horse and took one last look at the faces around him. Nako clasped his arm in the warrior's grip, wrist to wrist. Delgado placed his hand on Jack's knee and spoke a blessing in Apache, words that resonated with power and sincerity. Then Jack was riding, guided by two young warriors who would show him the path out. They moved through the darkness with practiced skill, avoiding the soldiers' positions, using every bit of cover. Within an hour, they had cleared the valley and were heading northeast, away from danger. The warriors who guided him stopped at a ridge overlooking miles of open country. One of them pointed to a distant cluster of lights, a settlement that meant safety. Then they clasped Jack's hand and turned back, disappearing into the night to rejoin their people. Jack sat his horse on that ridge, torn between the path ahead and the path behind. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to ride back and stand with the men who had become his brothers. But he had given his word to Delgado, and among the Apache, a man's word was sacred. He touched the carved horse in his pocket, felt the weight of Ayana's pouch hanging from his belt. Then he turned his horse toward the distant lights and rode into his uncertain future, carrying the memory of 6 girls and the people who had changed his life forever. Behind him, in a rocky defile surrounded by soldiers, 15 warriors prepared to make their stand, buying time for their families with courage and blood. Jack whispered a prayer to whatever gods might listen, asking them to keep those men safe, to let them see another dawn. Then he rode on through the darkness, alone once more but carrying their spirits with him.